The morning Neva Drummond climbed into a stranger's wagon outside the Coldwater station, she owned exactly 4 things. A wool coat with a torn left cuff she'd been meaning to mend for 3 months, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses and a small tin of sewing needles, a letter signed by a man named Silas Holt, offering room and board, and $12 a month in exchange for keeping his household, and a photograph of her mother that she kept folded inside her boot because it was the only place she was certain no one could take it. She was 26 years old. She had been a school teacher in Halifax until the school board decided they preferred a man for the position. She had been a bookkeeper for her uncle's dry goods shop until her uncle's creditors arrived in November and took the ledgers along with everything else. She had answered 6 mail-order advertisements between January and March. Only one had written back. The wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Doyle who worked for the general store in Ashford Creek, barely looked at her when she climbed up. He had a parcel to deliver north, he said. She could ride along as far as the Holt property. After that, she was on her own. She said thank you and held her carpetbag in her lap and watched the town of Coldwater disappear behind her. The land opened up after the last building fell away. Northern Ontario in April was the color of old pewter, bare birch stands and gray sky, and the occasional dark smear of spruce along the ridgeline. It was nothing like Halifax. It was nothing like anywhere she'd been. The space of it was almost alarming, the way the horizon just kept going. She thought about turning back approximately 4 times before Doyle pulled the wagon up a rutted track and nodded toward a farmhouse at the end of it, 2 stories. Gray wood siding, 1 shutter hanging crooked, a barn behind it that needed painting. A fence line she could see even from this distance had posts leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up arguing with the frost. The place looked like it had been managed by someone doing their best and losing ground anyway. Doyle left her at the end of the track, and she walked the rest of the way herself. Carpetbag in one hand, the letter in her coat pocket, in case she needed to prove she had any right to be here at all. The door opened before she knocked. A girl, maybe 8 years old, stood in the gap, studying her with the frank and unsettling assessment of a child who has learned to size people up quickly. Dark hair, her father's serious expression already in the set of her jaw. "You're the woman from the letter," the girl said. It wasn't a question, that's right. "I'm Neva," the girl considered this. "I'm Greta." She opened the door wider but didn't exactly step aside. "My father said you'd probably be plain." Neva looked at her. "Did he? He said not to mention it." Neva picked up her carpetbag and walked inside. Silas Holt was at the kitchen table. When she found him, not sitting so much as installed there, a large man made compact by something that had nothing to do with his size. There was a wooden crutch propped against the chair beside him. His left leg, she noticed without letting herself stare, was extended at an angle that suggested it didn't bend comfortably at the knee anymore. He looked up at her, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like the careful adjustment of a man who'd expected one thing and gotten another, and wasn't yet certain if that was better or worse. "Mrs. Drummond," he said. "Miss," she said. "Drummond was my father's name. I kept it." He didn't apologize for the assumption. She gave him points for that. Men who immediately apologized when they were wrong about something often did it to make themselves feel better rather than to acknowledge the error. "Silas Holt," he said, which she already knew. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit down if you want." She sat. Greta had followed her in and stood in the doorway to the hall, watching. "There's a boy, too," Silas said. "Theo, he's 8. Same age as Greta. They're twins. He's out in the barn right now doing something I probably told him not to do." "I see. And the terms you mentioned in your letter still stand." He said it the way someone says a thing that could be argued but isn't going to be, not today. 12 a month, your own room, meals included. He paused. "I need someone to run the house. Cook, clean, keep the children from burning things. There's also the accounts." "The accounts? Farm ledgers?" He met her eyes for the first time and held them. "I'm not much for the numbers end of things, never have been. Karen handled all of that." Karen was his wife. The letter had mentioned her in one sentence. Wife deceased, 2 children at home. She had died 14 months ago, Neva had gathered from the phrasing, and he'd been managing since. "I can keep accounts," she said. He nodded like that settled something. The room behind him was clean but bare. A cook stove, a table, 4 chairs, a window overlooking the yard. No curtains, no rugs. Every surface functional and nothing more, the way a house looks when someone is surviving in it rather than living. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "My wife's brother, his name is Conrad Price. He runs the Price operation about 4 miles east. He'll be coming around." He said it without inflection, the same way someone reports the weather. "When he does, I need you to be civil to him and nothing else." That's an unusual instruction. Most things worth saying are. She looked at him steadily. "Is there a reason?" His jaw tightened by a fraction. "There's always a reason. You'll see it for yourself soon enough." He pushed back from the table with the particular carefulness of a man who has recalculated every movement 100 times and still doesn't trust his own body to cooperate. He took the crutch and stood. And Neva watched him do it, without offering to help and without looking away. Because she'd learned quickly from her uncle's apprentice, who'd lost his right hand in a mill accident, that the worst thing you could do was pretend you weren't watching when you obviously were. Silas looked at her when he was upright. Something in his expression shifted again, like he'd half expected pity and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of it. "Greta will show you your room," he said. "Supper's at 6. That first week passed in the way all first weeks do, the accumulation of small information that adds up to a place. She learned that Theo had his father's stubbornness and his mother's laugh, which Silas occasionally heard through the kitchen walls and went still at without seeming to realize he'd done it. She learned that Greta read everything she could find and had strong and frequently wrong opinions about what she'd read, which she announced at the supper table as though daring someone to argue. She learned that Silas drank his coffee black and too strong and stood at the kitchen window every morning for 10 minutes before he went out, looking at the property like he was trying to memorize it. She started on the accounts on the 4th day, when Silas was out and the children were at the small schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. She found the ledgers in the desk in the front room, 3 of them, and she spread them out and started from the earliest date. She was good with numbers. She always had been. Her uncle had sometimes said she saw patterns in accounts the way some people see pictures in clouds. Quickly, instinctively, without having to try. By the end of the second ledger, she'd seen a pattern she didn't like. It started about a year before Karen died. The farm's income was consistent, reasonable for an operation this size. But the expenses had started to drift, supply costs slightly higher than they should be, contracts for grain and timber that had been renegotiated at terms less favorable to the Holt farm, a few arrangements marked as handled by C, price that seemed to settle at prices that made no sense. Conrad Price, the brother-in-law. She closed the ledgers and put them back exactly where she'd found them. She thought about what Silas had said. "He'll come around. Be civil. Nothing else." He arrived the following Tuesday. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A man who sat his horse the way certain men do, with the ease of someone who has always had things go his way and expects that to continue. He was maybe 40, well-dressed for the territory, with a face that had been handsome once and still traded on the memory of it. "Miss Drummond," he said, dismounting smoothly. "I've been meaning to come and introduce myself. I'm Conrad Price, Silas's brother-in-law." She kept her expression neutral. She'd been around enough men who opened with charm to know that charm was usually followed by something else. "Mr. Price," she said, "Silas isn't here at the moment. That's all right. I actually came to see how you're settling in." He smiled. "This is an isolated life for someone new to it. I want to make sure you know you have support." "That's very kind." His eyes moved over her face in a way that was measuring rather than appreciative. "I've been keeping an eye on things here since Karen passed. Silas has his limitations now, as I'm sure you've noticed." She kept her voice even. "Silas seems to manage very well." Something shifted behind Conrad's eyes. It happened quickly and then it was gone, replaced by the pleasant expression again. "Well, I just want you to know my door is always open. If you need anything, or if you have any concerns about the situation here." She felt the particular emphasis on that. "Please don't hesitate." She thanked him and watched him ride away and stood with her arms folded and a chill at the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the April air. That evening at supper she told Silas about the visit, keeping it brief and factual. His fork stopped moving midway through the meal. He set it down. "What did he want?" "He said he was welcoming me." She paused. "He mentioned your limitations." Silas looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "He does that. Uses language like that." His jaw was tight. "I want you to know whatever he implies about this farm or my ability to run it. I've seen the ledgers," she said. He went very still. "The older ones." She kept her voice the same way she kept it when she was talking to a child who'd broken something and was waiting to find out how much trouble they were in. "The ones from 3 years back. The expenses started shifting about a year before your wife died. Supply costs, contracts, renegotiated terms. Your brother-in-law's name appears repeatedly in the margins." The silence stretched out long enough that she heard the wind against the window. "I know," Silas said at last. His voice was flat. "I've known for a while that something was wrong. The numbers didn't make sense after the second year, but I couldn't." He stopped. He rubbed his jaw. "After the accident, everything was harder. I couldn't get out to check things the way I used to. Couldn't travel to town for meetings. Conrad offered to handle negotiations. I thought he was family. Yeah." He looked down. He was family. Greta was watching them from across the table with the careful attention of a child who understands more than adults think she does. Neva thought about the patterns in the ledger, the slow, methodical drift of an operation being quietly hollowed out. Not quickly, that would be too obvious, slowly. An inflated supply price here, a renegotiated contract there, the kind of damage that looked like bad luck from the outside. What happens to the farm if things keep going the way they're going, she asked. Silas met her eyes. In 2 years, maybe 3, I won't be able to carry the debt. I'll have to sell. She thought about what Conrad Price's face had looked like when she told him. Silas managed well. The way the pleasantness had flickered just for a second into something else, and he'd be the buyer. Silas looked at his hands. That's my guess. He owns the land east of mine. If he had this property too, he'd control the only good route between the river and the mill road. He could charge tolls, set terms for every farmer in this part of the county. He shook his head. I couldn't prove it. Every contract that went wrong had a reasonable explanation. Every inflated price came with an invoice. He's careful. He thinks you can't fight back, Neva said. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. He thinks that. She looked at him. Can you? A longer pause this time. Greta was still watching. Theo had put down his fork to listen too, though he was pretending not to. Not alone, Silas said finally. Neva picked up her fork and went back to her supper. Then we'll have to do it together. She felt rather than saw Silas look at her for a moment, before he picked up his fork again. It started with the accounts. Neva went through all 3 ledgers again, this time with paper and pencil beside her, noting every transaction where Conrad Price had been involved, every price that had drifted upward without obvious cause, every contract that had been renegotiated at the Holt farm's expense. It took her 3 days. By the end, she had 4 pages of notes, organized by date, cross-referenced against what the going rates for grain and timber and livestock had been in each of those years according to the back pages of the farming almanacs. She found on the shelf, the pattern was clear, neat, almost elegant in the way that well-executed wrongdoing sometimes was. She showed it to Silas on a Thursday evening after the children were in bed. He sat at the kitchen table and read through her notes without speaking. He read them twice. She poured coffee and didn't say anything. Just let him take his time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dark, with something that wasn't quite anger. Anger was loud. This was the quieter thing underneath anger, the thing that came when you'd suspected something and had been hoping you were wrong. He had my wife handling the accounts, Silas said. Before she got sick, she never questioned Conrad's involvement because he was her brother. She trusted him. Neva sat down across from him. Did she know? Before she died, I don't know. He looked at the table. She was sick for almost a year before. She might have seen it and not wanted to add to everything else we were dealing with. Or she might not have had the chance to look closely. He exhaled slowly. I'll never know. The silence had a different weight than the ones before. Neva let it sit. After a moment, Silas said, How do we prove this to someone who matters? She'd been thinking about that. We write to the suppliers. The ones where the prices went up unexpectedly. She tapped her notes. If Conrad was padding invoices or taking a cut from the middle, some of them might tell us. Especially if they've since parted ways with him. He might have people watching. Then we have to be careful. She looked at him. Keep acting like you don't know anything. Don't confront Conrad. Don't change the way you deal with him. He looked at her steadily. You're asking me to keep pretending I'm beaten. I'm asking you to let him think he's already won. She held his gaze. There's a difference. Something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not capitulation, the opposite of it. The look of a man who'd decided to stop reacting and start planning. All right, he said. They wrote 4 letters over the following 2 weeks, each one carefully worded, asking about past pricing and contract terms without revealing the reason for the questions. Neva drafted them at the kitchen table after supper, Silas beside her suggesting phrasing, both of them working in the quiet after the children went to bed. Greta walked in once to get a glass of water and stopped in the doorway looking at the papers spread between them. Is this about Uncle Conrad? She asked. Silas looked at her. Why would you think that? Because he came to see us last week when you were out, and he told me that you might have to sell the farm, and that it would probably be for the best. She said it flatly, without visible upset, but her eyes were watching her father closely. He said you weren't managing. Silas's face went very still. He said that to you. Yes. Greta picked up her glass of water. I told him I thought he was wrong. She went back to bed. Neva and Silas looked at each other across the table. He's talking to the children, Silas said. His voice was quiet and controlled in a way that meant the opposite of calm. He's trying to prepare the ground. She kept her voice even. Make it look like the outcome was inevitable, like everyone already understood it was coming. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, what else might he do? She'd been wondering the same thing. She'd spent enough time with her uncle's creditors to know that men who operated this way didn't like being surprised. They planned several moves ahead, and when they felt the plan beginning to slip, they didn't stop. They escalated. I don't know yet, she said honestly. but we should watch for it. Conrad came back 10 days later, this time with a man she didn't recognize. He introduced him as a land assessor, said there'd been some question about the property line on the eastern boundary. Just routine, they just need to walk the fence. Silas was out in the north field when they arrived. Neva met them on the step. You'll need to wait for Silas, she said. We don't need Silas for a boundary walk. Conrad's smile was still pleasant. His eyes weren't. Then you'll need to come back when he can be present, she said. I'm not comfortable with a land assessment happening without the owner present. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it cooled. Of course, he nodded. We'll come back. She watched them go and went directly to the north field. When she told Silas what had happened, he leaned on his crutch and looked toward the eastern fence line without speaking for a moment. Then he said, Last fall, Conrad had the fence line there surveyed. He said it was just updating records. I let him end? He paused. A week later, he told me the survey showed we'd had a post 3 yards over the line for 20 years. Made a fuss about it. I had to move the fence myself because... He stopped. Because I couldn't afford to hire anyone, and I couldn't prove he was wrong. She thought about that. Did you keep anything from that survey? A copy of the report. He came back with a copy. Said it was mine to keep. She held out her hand. Can I see it? He brought it from the house that evening, a folded paper that looked as though it had been handled and put away several times. She spread it on the table and looked at it for a long time. She'd done enough bookkeeping to know that numbers could be arranged to tell whatever story you needed them to tell, as long as no one looked closely at the source. She wasn't a surveyor, but she knew what a legitimate report looked like, and she knew what it looked like when something had been altered. The way the margin notes in a doctored ledger always sat slightly differently than the original entries. This report had been signed by someone, but the signature was a smear. The date had been corrected. The reference number in the corner didn't match the format of official county documents she'd seen pasted to the wall in the general store in Coldwater. This isn't real, she said. Silas looked at it. What do you mean? I mean it was made to look official. She set it down. Conrad had a fake survey done to convince you to move your own fence, which means the actual boundary line might still be exactly where it always was. He sat down heavily. He'd moved the fence himself. In November, on one leg, in mud that came up past the posts, because he couldn't afford to hire help and he couldn't, she understood now, he couldn't let himself fail publicly at something he used to do easily. I moved it for nothing, he said. You moved it because someone lied to you. That's different. He looked at the table. Neva said, We're going to need to prove more than just the accounts. This adds to it. The responses to their letters started arriving 3 weeks after they'd sent them. 2 suppliers confirmed that their prices to the Holt farm had been passed through Conrad Price, who had told them Silas preferred to have a middleman due to his difficulty traveling. One of them added, with the cheerful candor of a man who no longer did business with Conrad, that he'd since learned that Conrad had been collecting a percentage of each invoice for himself and adding it to the amounts billed to the Holt operation. The third letter was from a lumber contractor who had worked with Conrad for 2 years before dropping him. He wrote that he'd be willing to speak to anyone who needed to hear what he knew. The fourth letter arrived on a Friday morning. Neva brought it in from the post and read it twice before she brought it to Silas in the barn. It was from a woman named Genevieve Marsh, who had been Karen Holt's closest friend before Karen's death. She wrote that she'd seen this letter arrive and felt she had to respond. She wrote that in the last weeks of Karen's life, Karen had said something to her that she'd never been sure what to do with. She'd said that Conrad had told her something about Silas, that he'd shown her a doctor's report, and that the report said something about Silas's condition after the logging accident that had taken the function from his knee. She'd believed it because it came from her brother and it was in writing. And then she'd stopped asking questions. She hadn't said what the report contained. Silas read the letter. He read it again. His hands were steady, but something in his face was very still in the way that things are still before they move. He told her something, Neva said carefully. About your injury. He put the letter down on the workbench. His voice was quiet. After the accident, the doctor in Harrow said the knee was gone. No walking without support, probably worsening pain over time. He said that to me in September. I told Karen. What did Conrad say to her? He exhaled slowly. I don't know. He stopped. After October, she stopped asking how I was. Stopped asking about the knee. I thought she was tired. She was sick by then. I thought she was just... He stopped again. He'd thought she'd stopped caring. Neva didn't say that. It was in his face anyway. What if he told her the prognosis was worse than you knew? That you'd lose the leg entirely? Or worse? Silas looked at the wall. He'd have shown her something official looking. A document, like the survey. A fake report. To make her stop asking. To make her stop thinking about recovery. To isolate you. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way it had been when Greta told him what Conrad had said to her. He used her last year, Silas said. Whatever she believed in those last months, he put it there. Neva said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. After a moment, he straightened. His hands were shaking very slightly. We need to take this to someone. The county magistrate in Harrow, she said. We need to bring the accounts, the letters, the survey report, the letter from Mrs. Marsh, everything together. And if it's not enough, she looked at him steadily. Then we keep looking until it is. But I think it's enough. He nodded once. The look on his face was the particular expression of a man who has decided to stop absorbing damage and start doing something about it, and finds the change uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. They rode into Harrow the following Wednesday. Silas drove the wagon, Neva beside him with the papers in a leather folder she'd found in the desk. The children stayed with the Merriweather family down the road who had a girl Greta's age. Greta had asked at breakfast what they were going to Harrow for, and Silas had said, to set something straight. Greta had nodded like she'd expected that answer. The county magistrate was a gray-haired man named Aldridge, who listened without interrupting and made notes in a slow, methodical hand. He looked at the ledger copies, the supplier letters, the fake survey, the letter from Mrs. Marsh. He asked several questions. He thanked them and said he would be in touch. They rode home mostly in silence. About halfway there, Silas said, he'll talk to Conrad before he does anything. I know, she looked out at the birch trees. By then it might not matter what Conrad says. The evidence is already there. Or Conrad will have an explanation for all of it. Then we'll need look at him. Do you know anyone else who's had trouble with him? Contracts that went wrong, who's had trouble make sense? 2 families, east of the mill road. He said it like he'd been thinking about it already. I heard things over the years. Didn't add them up properly. We should talk to them. He looked at her sideways. She kept her face straight. You have a better suggestion? No, he said after a moment. He almost smiled. No, I don't. They spoke to the Kessler family the following week, and to a widower named Brant Culver the week after that. Both had stories that fit the pattern. Contracts renegotiated through Conrad's connections. Prices that didn't match what others in the area were paying. A sense that things had been going wrong in ways that were hard to pin down. Both were willing to speak to Aldridge if asked. Conrad came by the farm on a Saturday morning when the children were playing in the yard. Neva was on the porch. She saw him coming from the end of the track and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite fear, but the recognition of the moment when a situation stops being theoretical. He dismounted and looked at her and then at the house. There was something different about his expression. The pleasantness was still there, but it had pulled thin over something underneath. Is Silas here? In the barn. She didn't move from the step. Can I help you with something? He looked at her for a long moment. You've been busy, he said. She kept her voice level. I keep a busy household. He looked past her toward the barn. I've been hearing some things, Miss Drummond. Questions being asked around the county. About contracts and prices, he paused. About me, people ask questions about all kinds of things. His expression shifted. Not pleasantness anymore, something more direct. I'd be careful, he said, about starting conversations that go in directions you don't expect. This situation is more complicated than it looks from the outside. She looked at him calmly. Is that a warning? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a friendly observation. The barn door opened and Silas came out, moving with that measured deliberateness she'd come to recognize. He used the crutch, but he moved at his own pace, not hurried, not apologetic. He crossed the yard and stopped a few feet from Conrad. Something passed between them. The particular silence of 2 men who've known each other a long time and have reached the end of something, Silas, Conrad said. I was just telling Miss Drummond. I heard you, Silas said. He said it quietly. His eyes were steady. I need you to leave. Conrad's jaw tightened. We have things to discuss. The farm, the accounts, the direction, there's nothing to discuss. Silas held his gaze. I know what you've been doing, Conrad. I've known for a while and now I have the records to prove it. If you want to talk to someone about it, talk to Aldridge. Don't come back here. Something crossed Conrad's face quickly. Calculation, anger, and underneath those something that might have been for just a moment, the awareness that he'd misjudged how much time he had. He mounted his horse without another word and rode away. Neva let out a breath she hadn't fully known she was holding. Silas stood watching until Conrad was out of sight. Then he turned. His hands were shaking very slightly again. That's done, he said. For now. She watched the empty track. He'll go to Aldridge first and try to get ahead of whatever we said. Let him. Silas looked at the papers she'd carried out to the porch without thinking. Then he looked at her. You brought those out in case you needed them. She'd done it without planning to. Yes. He nodded. Something in his expression was different from how he'd looked when she'd arrived that first day. Not the carefully managed blankness, but something more open. The look of a man who'd put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. Aldridge sent word 2 weeks later. He'd spoken to the Kessler family and to Brant Culver. He'd contacted the suppliers. He'd located the surveyor whose name had been forged on the boundary report and confirmed the man had never worked in this county. He was requesting Conrad Price present himself for a formal interview. He added, in a careful phrase at the end of the letter, that he believed the Holt Farm's eastern boundary fence had been moved without cause and that the original line should be restored. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table. Greta and Theo both pretended to eat their breakfast and failed at it. "Does that mean we're all right?" Theo asked. "Yes," Silas said. He set the letter down. "That's what it means." Greta went back to her porridge without comment, but she sat up a little straighter in her chair. Theo grinned and knocked over his milk, and then they were all dealing with the milk and the moment passed, which was the right way for that kind of moment to pass. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not easy. Recovery, Neva was learning, was not a dramatic thing. It was the slow, daily work of making something function again after it had been damaged. New contracts negotiated directly without anyone in the middle. Fences fixed, including the eastern line, which Silas relocated himself on a cold May morning, with Neva holding the measuring rope and Theo handing up posts and Greta supervising from the fence rail. She'd started in the evenings working on his knee. She'd learned the technique from a nurse in Halifax who'd treated men coming back from logging camps with joint injuries, and she applied it the same way she did everything, methodically, without commentary, willing to be wrong if the results suggested she was. The first time she asked him if she could try, he'd said nothing for a long moment. "You don't have to," he said finally. "I know I don't." Another pause. It's not something I let people see. I understand that." She kept her voice the same. "I've already seen you at your worst, Silas. Last winter when you were trying to reset that fence post alone in the frost with your leg giving out. You didn't stop. You finished the post." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to think less of you because your knee is damaged. I'd like to see if I can help it hurt less." He looked at the window for a moment. Then he nodded. She worked carefully, learning the particular architecture of injury, where the muscle had locked, where it had atrophied, where pressure helped and where it didn't. He said very little. He was the same in this as he was in everything else. Minimal, direct, and more present than he appeared. He told her once, after about 2 weeks, that the night pain had lessened. She said, "Good. Keep stretching it in the morning like I showed you." He did. They didn't talk much in those evening sessions, but they talked more than they had at the beginning. Pieces of information exchanged without ceremony, the way people share things when they're doing something else with their hands. She told him once about her uncle's shop, the night the creditors arrived, standing in the street afterward with a single bag, because she'd known 3 days before it was coming, and had been quietly ready. "You knew before it happened," he said. "I saw it in the accounts." She kept her hands moving on his calf. "The numbers told me 2 weeks before anyone said anything out loud. And you didn't warn him?" She paused. "I told him once. He told me I was being dramatic." After that, she shrugged. "You can only say a thing once." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's why you noticed the ledgers here so quickly." "Yes." He looked at her with the particular directness that was his way of paying attention. "You've been used for your usefulness before," he said, and then dismissed. "It wasn't a question." "More than once," she said. He nodded slowly. "I hired you for your usefulness. I know that. I want you to know I understand the difference," he said carefully, "between that and what's actually happening here." His voice was careful the way his movements were careful, deliberate, nothing wasted. "Whatever this arrangement was supposed to be, it's become a something else. I'm aware of that." She kept her face neutral, but her hands stilled briefly. "So am I." The silence that followed was not the silences of early days, when they'd been two people at a careful distance. This one had something else in it, something that had built up slowly, the way things that are worth having do. Conrad Price left the county in June. Aldridge sent word that charges had been formally laid: fraud, forgery. One count related to a contract arrangement with a mill operator in Harrow that turned out to be the tip of a considerably larger problem than anyone had expected. He would not be managing anyone's farm business for a long time. Silas read that letter standing at the kitchen window, the same place he stood every morning. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket. That was all. At supper that evening, Neva told the children what had happened in terms they could understand. Greta already knew most of it. Theo asked 2 questions and then announced he wanted more bread. After supper, when the children were occupied with their own things, Silas found her in the garden, where she'd been putting in the kitchen bed she'd been meaning to start since April. He stood at the edge of the garden with his crutch and looked at what she'd done. She looked up at him. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said. She sat back on her heels. "I beg your pardon? Whatever you came here to do, he said it slowly, like he was choosing each word. You've done it. The accounts are clean. Conrad is gone. The farm is, he paused. The farm is going to be all right. He looked at the sky and then at her. You're not obligated to stay. She pulled a weed and dropped it in the pile. And if I want to stay, that would also be all right, he said after a moment. She looked up at him. He was looking at the garden beds, not at her. His expression had the quality it sometimes got when he was saying something that cost him something, and he was holding very still to manage it. Silas. He looked at her then. The reason I want to stay isn't the accounts, she said. I think you know that. The lines around his eyes shifted. Yes, he said. I know that. Then we don't need to have this conversation, she said. He almost smiled. You're very practical. One of us has to be. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'm not easy to live with. I should probably say that. I've noticed. She started on the next row. I'm not particularly easy either. We seemed to manage. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said her name. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for coming here, for seeing what was happening for. He paused, and the pause had everything in it that he wasn't the kind of man to say at length. All of it. She held his gaze. You're welcome. He nodded once, and there was something in the nod that was more than agreement. Summer came to the property the way it does in that part of Ontario. Slowly, and then all at once, green pushing up through the gray. The fence line stood where it had always stood. The accounts balanced with the kind of quiet confidence that means someone is paying attention. The kitchen garden came in well. Better than expected, Silas said, though he said it the same way he said most things, which meant he was pleased. Theo learned to drive the small wagon that summer, badly and with great enthusiasm. Greta finished every book on the shelf and demanded more, which Neva arranged through the Harrow Lending Library by correspondence, which Greta considered barely adequate but acknowledged was better than nothing. Silas's knee was not fixed. It would never be fixed. But it was better in the careful, incremental way that things get better when someone pays attention to them over a long time. He still needed the crutch on bad days. The bad days became slightly less frequent. He stopped standing at the kitchen window in the mornings, like he was memorizing the property in case he lost it. One evening in August, sitting on the step in the warm dusk with the sound of Theo arguing with Greta about something in the barn, Silas said without preamble, I'd like this to be permanent. Neva looked at him. Permanent, you, here. He said it the way he said most things. Directly, without ornamentation, a little rough around the edges, in a way that was more honest than polish. The children. The arrangement. Whatever it is, she thought about the letter she'd read in the Coldwater station. The bare, cautious language of it. Room and board and $12 a month. The economy of a man who'd learned to hold things at arm's length. She thought about arriving to find a girl in the doorway, who'd already been told not to mention that her father expected plain. She thought about 4 pages of notes and late evenings at the table and a knee that was better, not fixed, but better. Whatever it is, she agreed. He reached over and took her hand. He did it the way he did everything, with thought, with intention, with none of the casualness that means you're not really paying attention. She turned her hand over and held it. In the barn, Theo's voice rose over something that was clearly deeply unfair. Greta's response was brief and final, then silence, which probably meant they'd found something to do together that didn't involve arguing. The sky went dark over the spruce ridge. The first stars came out, one by one, the way they always do, not in a rush, just appearing, as if they'd been there all along and only needed the light to go for you to see them.